Welcome to the Unit 2 overview video. Throughout the course of this video, I'll discuss topics to expect within Chapter 7, as well as the provided online reading link through the U.S. legal system article on drug testing, how you can earn your engagement point this week, as well as our roadmap and a brief discussion of the content involved within your particular readings before ending with a discussion on applied activity number 2. So let's get into it. Unit 2, our foundational piece for this unit is Chapter 7, which covers constitutional law. And in my opinion, constitutional law has really fascinating intersections with sports, especially at the amateur level. In the textbook, you'll read about the origins of the US Constitution as a quick history refresher. And then you'll dive into the First Amendment, which covers freedom of speech, freedom of religion. You'll also read about the 14th Amendment, which ensures the equal protection under the law, also prohibits intentional discrimination by a state actor. You'll also read about the Fifth Amendment, which protects due process rights, which really comes into play when someone is deprived of their right to life, to liberty, or to property by a state actor. And then the second reading for this unit attempts to connect these topics surrounding constitutional law to a concrete action within a sports setting, and that's drug testing. So, throughout the course of this video, I really encourage you to watch the chapter portions before reading to help frame your thinking. And as I mentioned in the Unit 1 overview video, I strongly recommend that you take notes while reading this chapter so that you're prepared for the applied activity number 2 as well as the chapter quizzes, as this area of law is tends to be very philosophically dense. And if we were in law school, we would be spending an entire course just specifically on constitutional law. Jumping into how you can earn your engagement point for Unit 2. This one's pretty straightforward. I would like for you to look up and respond to the questions listed on the screen related to terms that are discussed in Unit 1. So, what you'll do is write up each term that corresponds to each definition and then email it to me with my email on the screen. So, the first one is what's the term for the circumstances that give rise to a lawsuit? The second, who or what do we call the person, group, or organization who brings the lawsuit forward? Three, what do we call the person, group, or organization being sued? And four, what is defined as a formal request to a higher court to review the lower court's decision? So I encourage you, pause, do this right now, look back at some of your Unit 1 notes, and send this over to me. We are now going to pivot for our unit plan slash roadmap for this particular week. So we have our engagement that's due Friday at 11:59. Additionally, we have your initial post for the Unit 2 discussion forum due on Friday. On Sunday, you have your chapter quizzes for Chapter 7 and the U.S. legal system link. You have your 2 reply posts and your applied activity number 2 due on Sunday. Stay tuned for the end of the video for a discussion on applied activity number 2. For now, we're going to jump into each chapter area so you can have an idea of what to expect when reading. So, Chapter 7, as I mentioned earlier, is really this foundational piece for us in this unit because it covers everything that you would need to know to get the basics of how constitutional law intersects with sports settings. So, by the end of reading this chapter and learning more about this material and interacting with it, the intention is for you to understand how the US Constitution applies to private and public sport entities. How does the First Amendment protect free speech as well as freedom of religion? How does it regulate religious prayers and activities within sports settings? Can you distinguish between 2 types of due process, substantive and procedural, as well as how do their requirements apply within sport organizations? And finally, explain how the Equal Protection Clause, which is contained within the 14th Amendment, affects sport-related affirmative action plans. Before I begin just a quick conversation about this topic area, I wanted to share this quote from you, with you. The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. This quote was actually shared by a former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes. And this quote attempts to capture, I think, 2 things at once. First, recognizing that the US legal system operates using stare decisis, so it operates on case precedent. The second piece that I think that this quote communicates is that experience plays a role within how judges interpret the law, and that the Supreme Court of today's world, which is here listed on our screen, has been looking at cases that are very different than when our country was founded. Some examples that you'll read about in relation to freedom of speech: social media was not a thing, obviously, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So part of that interpretation and evaluation process from a legal perspective involves being able to look at the different social and contextual factors that are at play within our society today and how that applies to the law. So, as a disclaimer, there are some things that you'll read in the textbook that are not necessarily completely and entirely up to date. Like you might read something and think to yourself, I thought that this was a little bit different now. Keep in mind that this textbook was published about 4 years ago, which means it was written a little bit before that. So this information updates and is updated regularly. So if you have that thought to yourself, I encourage you, go ahead, look it up, research to see how this has evolved over time. I'm now going to pivot into some key concepts for this chapter. So constitutional law in and of itself is defined as the application of the federal, state, and local governments and whether their actions violate one or more terms of the US Constitution. One term that is absolutely central to this topic area is state action. State action consists of any action of the federal or state governments or their subdivisions, such as city, county governments, or agencies. It is the threshold for any constitutional challenge. You must have state action in order to bring forth a lawsuit involving a violation of constitutional rights. So, this is the first thing that courts will evaluate. Was there state action present within this particular case at hand? One of the other things that they'll look at is were there state actors involved? So if we know that state action is basically any form of government action, state actors are people who act in furtherance of their positions as employees of the government agencies, aka they are acting on behalf of the government. So examples of state actors: public school teachers, police officers, IRS employees, county government employees, even athletic directors at state-run institutions. So let's take a look at this within a sports setting, how this could intersect with a current role or a future professional role that you might have. So who are state actors? This most commonly impacts high school and college athletes. So examples of state actors here: public school teachers, employees, again, of county governments. The athletic director of Millersville University is someone who's considered to be a state actor. They are acting on behalf of the state government in their role. And then I'm sure a favorite place of everyone within the class, DMV, the employees there are considered state actors. They are employed by a government agency. Again, they are acting on behalf of the government in their professional role. People who are not state actors: professional athletes, professional teams. First of all, professional sport teams are private entities. They are not government agencies, so that's why they're not state actors. Second, professional athletes, again, are not employed by the government within their role. They also agree to collective bargaining agreements within their specific sports league, so they are not considered to be state actors. So because of this, these particular individuals or organizations, you can't bring forward a constitutional claim saying your constitutional rights have been violated by a professional sport team organization because there's no state action. As a reminder, state action is the threshold, for any lawsuit involving a violation of constitutional rights. Flipping back to this screen here, one other important thing that I wanted to share with you and that you'll read about in the textbook is actually that the NCAA is not considered to be a state actor. So you'll read a little bit more about this and perhaps why it is interesting for us to consider. So this final portion of our discussion on Chapter 7, I just wanted to briefly describe what you can expect as far as key amendments within the U.S. Constitution that intersect with sport management. So the first is the First Amendment. So this will discuss how freedom of speech is classified within sports settings, high school and college sport. The textbook will share some foundational cases related to First Amendment issues in educational settings, as well as discuss the protection levels for types of speech, such as political speech or commercial speech. It will also share, in relation to freedom of religion, two clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause includes that separation between church and state, and the Free Exercise Clause protects private religious rights. The second key amendment is the 14th Amendment, and this includes the Equal Protection Clause, or the EPC. And this prohibits the government from denying persons equal protection under the law. Types that are discussed in the textbook are de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination, along with affirmative action. The final key amendment discussed within this chapter is the Fifth Amendment, and this encompasses the Due Process Clause, the DPC. And this particular clause provides a course of legal proceedings that protect and enforce private rights against their potential deprivation by the government, by a state actor. The purpose of the Due Process Clause is to prevent arbitrary or unreasonable decisions. It's also intended to guarantee fairness and impartiality when someone's right to life, right to liberty, or right to property are deprived by a state actor. As you're reading, I encourage you to think of any questions that you have, and please reach out to me with those, as I'm more than happy to walk you through anything. And now we're going to move to your final assigned reading for this unit, and that's the U.S. legal system article pertaining to drug testing. So, some objectives for you to check your own knowledge once reading and completing this particular assignment is: can you identify drug use and testing issues across different competitive levels, professional, intercollegiate, interscholastic sports? Can you explain how the due process clause is connected to drug testing violations or substance use violations within sport? And then finally, describe and discuss the various constitutional issues presented by some drug testing policies at the high school and collegiate level. The final learning objective pertains to your applied activity number 2, which will directly relate back to the topic of drug testing. So before we get there, just some key concepts for you to know before you read this particular article. The first thing is that drug and substance use has been discovered in athletes at all ages and at every level of competition. Every professional sport has instituted some form of drug testing or monitoring program. The NCAA requires student athletes to sign a consent form from drug testing. Many high schools have instituted drug policies for student athletes. The important thing here is that drug testing within professional and amateur sports have very different legal issues. So, when the government or a governmental entity, such as a public school or a public college, desires to test a student athlete for drugs, this constitutes state action. And again, state action is a threshold for any lawsuit that involves a violation of constitutional rights. So, drug testing of athletes is becoming common in all sports to one degree or another. This raises a variety of constitutional issues, including the right to privacy, which is included in the Fourth Amendment, as well as right to due process, which is discussed in the Due Process Clause in the Fifth Amendment. And a lot of this surrounds how to protect people from illegal search and seizures, particularly since drug testing involves an analysis of a sample from someone's urine or blood. So these are things that will be briefly discussed and covered at international as well professional and amateur settings within this particular article, and directly lead to your applied activity number 2. So after you read the U.S. legal link, you'll be prepared to read the Palmer v. Merluzzi link. Again, I recommend reading both chapter 7 and this particular link before starting this particular activity. So in this case, a high school football player, Dan Palmer, was suspended for 10 days from school and 60 days from athletics for admitting to drinking beer and smoking marijuana on school property. Palmer argued that the additional athletic suspension violated his constitutional rights to due process and equal protection. You'll read more about how the court interprets participation in high school sports and due process rights at that particular competitive level. Prior to reading, I recommend reading your notes for due process rights in Chapter 7, as well as the U.S. legal link. I would also probably set aside between 1.5 to 2 hours to complete this activity in total to ensure that you are not rushed because you'll read through the full case, you'll take a quiz on the case, and then provide written answers to the particular activity itself in connection to these two topic areas. That concludes our Unit 2 overview video. Again, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you have. More than happy to discuss any topic with you. Have a good one.